Happy holidays and welcome to the Jeremiah Patterson Show. I just want to mention that this is a pre-recorded episode. We never really done this before, but this is a pre-recorded episode, so anything I say in this episode, if there is updated reporting on it, it may not comport with your understanding in terms of the news situation, but just for your curiosity and just for circumstances and just to admit this is a pre-recorded episode. Okay. On September 16th, 2007, a convoy of Blackwater contractors who were tasked with protecting State Department employees entered a crowded area. This was a square near the Mansour district in Baghdad, Iraq, and then a bomb went off. And that is when this happened. A son, who was driving his mother to pick up his father from the hospital where he worked as a pathologist, this son and his mother were essentially driving to pick up his father from the hospital. And as they approached the Nassauer Square, they didn't know that a bomb went off nearby this convoy of these 4 armored vehicles carrying Blackwater guards who had automatic rifles. Subsequently, a bullet tore through the head of this son, who was with his mother. A bullet tore through his head, and he was driving to pick up his father, and he slumped forward. He slumped as the car rolled forward. Here was another account on that day about a 9-year-old boy. Quote, Muhammad was thrilled when the United States entered Baghdad years earlier in 2003. Muhammad met members of the United States Army on the streets and handed out candy and juice when he saw them. Muhammad was a businessman dealing in auto salvage. He despised Saddam Hussein and his oppressive and vindictive rule. Muhammad was glad Saddam's reign of terror was finally ending. When Muhammad saw the convoy enter the traffic circle, he initially thought that they were just regular U.S. Army members. Being so close to the green zone, he thought someone important might be entering or leaving the area. That wasn't unusual. But when the shooting started, his life and the lives of his entire family changed forever. Luckily before his SUV was attacked, Muhammad, his sister, and their children had time to duck into the car. Muhammad and his sister screamed for their children to get down. Bullets were everywhere. Muhammad would look to see what was happening. He saw that the man next to him run. Machine gun fire tore through his body. Shots were fired everywhere. Muhammad could see other cars being shot at. The Blackwater guards were firing indiscriminately. Iraqi traffic police initially tried to wave down the Blackwater men, essentially saying to them that there was no threat, but they had to run for cover themselves. Muhammad kept seeing the man on the ground next to him being fired upon as he lay dead. Machine gun fire would cause his lifeless body to shake in his pool of blood. In the middle of the attack, Muhammad could not understand why this man lying dead was a target. He could not understand what was happening or why, but he knew he was surviving as he kept yelling for the children in the back of his SUV to stay down. The shooting ended as suddenly as it started. The 4 armored vehicles drove away. Everything was eerily quiet. Muhammad had been shot. His sister was safe. Muhammad had not been shot. His sister was safe. He thought they had been given a miracle after he saw that so many others had been killed. Then one of his sister's children said that Ali was hurt. Muhammad quickly got out of the car and saw blood inside the rear window. Ali slumped over against the glass. When Muhammad opened the door, his son fell toward him as his skull opened and a large part of Ali's brain fell into the pavement between his father's feet. Video of the aftermath includes an image of a human brain on the road in Nassauer Square. Muhammad turned his bullet-riddled SUV around and drove back to the closest hospital, only a few blocks behind him. He was driving on flat tires and with a shattered windshield. The headrest next to him where his sister sat had a bullet hole through it. It was as if someone had targeted the area in his SUV where a person's head would have been. Muhammad knew his son's injuries were fatal, but he had to try. When he arrived at the hospital, it was a war zone. Victims were everywhere. More were arriving in the backs of trucks. The hallways were full. It was chaotic. Muhammad forced a doctor to take a look at Ali. They could not do anything for him. He was told they had to go to a neurologic hospital on the other side of Baghdad. An ambulance was called, and Ali and Muhammad were rushed to the other side of the town. As Muhammad held his son's hand, he convulsed and died in the back of the ambulance. Ali Kanani was 9 years old when he was shot in the head by Blackwater guards on September 16, 2007 in a traffic circle in Baghdad, Iraq. End quote. Max Fisher writes on Twitter, quote, one of the Blackwater contractors continued shooting civilians in the crowd, even as his colleagues shouted over and over for ceasefire. One had to pull a gun on him to force him to stop. One of the people he shot was a mother clutching her infant. End quote. We know that 14 people died on that day and 17 others were wounded. Blackwater is a private security firm. It essentially had a contract with the United States State Department at that time, but after the shooting, that contract was essentially revoked. In 2013, all 4 of these men who committed these murders by openly shooting at these civilians were indeed indicted. This is what the indictment read, quote, on or about September 16, 2007, in the city of Baghdad in the Republic of Iraq, defendants Paul Slow, Nicholas Slatton, Evan Liberty, and Dustin Hurd unlawfully and intentionally, upon a sudden quarrel and heat of passion, did commit voluntary manslaughter by killing the following individuals. End quote. And then it goes on to list the people who were killed in this horrific attack by these Blackwater security guards. The next year, in 2014, a very emotional judge, as he was sentencing these 4 men, a very emotional judge rendered these 4 men their sentences. All of them were found guilty. They were sentenced, essentially 3 of them were sentenced to at least 30 years in prison, and a life in prison for the other person. Remember, there were 4 of them. What happened here was just reprehensible. It was diabolical as well. I mean, for this to happen, so you have these Blackwater guards who are working with this who work under this private security firm. Blackwater is a private security firm. They were tasked with protecting State Department employees, and then all of a sudden this bomb goes off in Nisawa Square, and they just start indiscriminately shooting. They just start firing, and this continues. The death count goes up exponentially. Multiple people are wounded, multiple witnesses, including the death of a 9-year-old boy who was shot in the back of the head. And so justice for these victims, fighting for justice for these victims was a lot. To fight for justice for these victims, because essentially under Blackwater's contract with the United States State Department, these Blackwater guards were immune from prosecution. They were immune from civil or criminal exposure. And so fighting to get these guys prosecuted, fighting to get these guys in jail and in prison and sentenced for what they had did here, that would take a while. And the fight was exhaustive. It was deliberate. It was meticulous, but they did it. Because that is what the United States justice system promised them. That is what the United States judicial promised them. Remember, right? Equal justice under the law. The rule of law is essential in this country. That is essentially what we are under as a democratic republic in this country. The rule of law, the United States judicial system, equitable. It doesn't matter who you know or where you come from. Equal justice under law. And now it appears that all that time was wasted. Earlier this week, President Donald J. Trump pardoned all 4 of these members of this Blackwater security firm. He pardoned all 4 of these convicted murderers, and that has been met with vehement criticism. One of the attorneys representing the family of the 9-year-old boy who was killed said, quote, "The Nassau Square massacre was the FBI's most comprehensive and expensive criminal investigation since 9/11. Dozens of witnesses were brought to the United States to testify about what happened on September 16, 2007. The efforts of the investigators, the prosecutors, and the men and women who supported them was immeasurable. The expense was to show that to the people of Iraq that the U.S. government would hold people accountable for their crimes, no matter when or where they were committed. It is unfortunate and sad that those efforts have now been wasted. These men will now be free despite their crimes, and they will not serve the time in prison they deserved. My clients assuredly feel ignored, mistreated, and used. Their belief in our legal system was misplaced. The result is not just that we see an injustice in the United States, but that the world must surely see cracks in the pillars of justice upon which our system is based. That may be the overriding damage caused by these pardons." End quote. And so, as I said earlier, Blackwater is a private security firm owned by Erik Prince. Erik Prince, of course, is the brother of the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, which serves under the Trump administration, under President Trump since 2017. Now, we don't know if there was sort of like a connection or a correlation between that and these pardons, but based on public reporting, this is what we know. Erik Prince is Betsy DeVos's brother. And this mass shooting has received lots of criticism towards the company, of which Erik Prince himself is essentially the head of that company. And Erik Prince has received criticism for this mass shooting as well, given that this happened under his watch. These were his people, his employees. But what has been more appalling and has received lots more criticism as well is these pardons. Hassam Salam, who was among the Iraqis who was shot but survived this attack, said this, quote, "Today we were surprised that the American president issued a decision to pardon these criminals, murderers, and thugs. I'm really shocked. The American judiciary is fair and equitable. I had never imagined that Trump or any other politician would affect American justice." End quote. The United Nations Human Rights Office released a statement in reference to these pardons, saying that they are, quote, "deeply concerned," end quote. These aren't the only people that Trump pardoned this week. Remember when Russia hacked into the 2016 presidential elections? And we had this big investigation by now former special counsel Robert Mueller to essentially investigate the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections. Well, President Trump has just pardoned George Papadopoulos, his former foreign policy advisor, during the 2016 presidential campaign. George Papadopoulos later pleaded guilty in 2017 to making mendacious statements to federal investigators as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. Trump also pardoned Alex Vanderswan, an attorney who pleaded guilty for also making false assertions to federal investigators, and they both served short prison sentences. The New York Times reports on these other pardons that Trump did earlier this week and that he issued. Quote, the three former members of Congress pardoned by Mr. Trump were Duncan Hunter of California, Chris Collins of New York, and Steve Stockman of Texas. Mr. Hunter was set to begin serving an 11-month sentence next month. He pleaded guilty in 2019 to one charge of misusing campaign funds. Mr. Collins, an early supporter of Mr. Trump, had been serving a 26-month sentence after pleading guilty in 2019 to charges of making false statements to the FBI, and to conspiring to commit securities fraud. Mr. Stockman was convicted in 2018 on charges of fraud and money laundering and had been serving a 10-year sentence. Sidney Powell, the lawyer and election conspiracy theorist who Mr. Trump considered making a White House special counsel to investigate election fraud, argued that he was a candidate for a pardon. End quote. So all of this has just happened. And then more controversial pardons were issued. Yesterday, the president pardoned Paul Manafort, his former campaign manager, who was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Based on public reporting, we also know that before Paul Manafort came to work on with Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential in his 2016 presidential campaign, that Paul Manafort, excuse me, had worked for a Russian oligarch and just decided to come work for the Trump campaign. Also, there is this sort of inexplicable thing. It has never really been explained. This inexplicable thing of how Paul Manafort essentially arranged for this Russian oligarch to receive Trump polling, sort of campaign data, polling data, essentially to share that information with this Russian oligarch. That is still inexplicable. Also, you may recall in July earlier this year, that we covered that former special counsel Robert Mueller essentially said, "Hey, Roger Stone, congratulations on the president commutating your prison sentence, but you are still a convicted felon, and rightfully so, given what you did, tampering with witnesses and obstructing justice." Well, Roger Stone, whose sentence was commuted in July of this year by the president, among those pardoned yesterday, Roger Stone was pardoned by the president. Also, another person who was pardoned by the president was Charles Kushner, the father of Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. And of course, there were other people on that list that the president pardoned. These are just some of the more high-profile figures, and reportedly in these very, very controversial pardons that President Donald Trump has just issued. So all of this is happening at once. I mean, this has just been a very, very crazy news week. We know that President Trump is in Mar-a-Lago right now, and we don't know if the president could be issuing more pardons. But all of this is happening at once. We know that the president granted 15 pardons on Tuesday, I believe, and 5 commutations of sentences. We know that the president also yesterday reportedly just issued 26 pardons. People are already characterizing this as an abhorrent abuse of the pardon power. I mean, there is no question that this is an abhorrent abuse of the presidential pardon power that is exclusively given to the President of the United States. I mean, that is sort of what we are as a democratic republic. This power is so exclusive, so essential, that it is only given and entrusted with one person, one man, or perhaps one day one woman, the President of the United States. This essential, this critical, this sort of very, very high, essentially, my apologies, I'm trying to characterize this very high thing. It is the pardon power. It is only granted to the President of the United States. He himself controls that. And presidents in the past have abused the pardon power. I talked multiple times on this show about President George H.W. Bush abusing the pardon power when he pardoned those 6 controversial figures involved in the Iran-Contra affair. President Bill Clinton abused the pardon power. Earlier this year, President Donald Trump abused the pardon power. President George W. Bush abused the pardon power. So this is not something new. We know this before, given our current history. So, I know. Another thing that is worth mentioning, another thing I think is worth mentioning here is that the President Trump did not essentially, the pardon thing is essentially supposed to go through the United States Justice Department. Apparently, based off these pardons and that they are so controversial and receive so much backlash, this did not go through the U.S. Justice Department. This was sort of the president just saying, "I'm going to do whatever I want in these final days." We know earlier this year that the President Trump issued a very controversial pardon when he pardoned disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who reportedly lied to the FBI about his contacts with the Russian ambassador about sanctions upon Donald Trump winning the election, and he reportedly lied about that to the FBI when he knew, in fact, that he did have those contacts with the Russian ambassador. Andrew Weissman, as I said before, the president has just issued all these controversial pardons, and I say that for just here is one more thing to consider here. The president has just issued all these controversial pardons, but they may backfire. Andrew Weissman served on former special counsel Robert Mueller's team, and here's how he explained this on the Rachel Maddow show yesterday. Here's how he explained how these pardons by President Trump may backfire if Donald Trump is prosecuted upon leaving office.
So, this is the kind of thing, when I hear this news, I put on my sort of former Brooklyn prosecutor hat of, okay, what can we do? And there are actually two things that the next attorney general can do with respect to the president, because the president has a very, very broad power to pardon, but he cannot pardon in exchange for something. In other words, there cannot be a bribe or a quid pro quo. So we talked last night about the pardon for Esformis, this major healthcare fraud defendant. And there you sort of really question, how did that happen? And the next attorney general can look into whether Trump or anyone else did this as a quid pro quo. Was there some money, for instance, would be the classic case. Second, the president may not be able to pardon himself. I'm sure he's going to try to do it. But, the president faces criminal exposure for obstruction of the Mueller investigation. And what we're seeing in the last few days is basically a confession. This is such strong evidence of obstruction. He's carrying out the dangled pardons that you referred to. He is now carrying out in real time. And one of the things that you can do as a federal prosecutor is you can put Paul Manafort and Roger Stone into the grand jury and ask them questions. And obviously you would wait until January 20th so that the president can't interfere with this. And you can ask them questions about, what were your communications with the White House? Why did you lie for the president? A whole series of questions. Now, if Paul Manafort or Roger Stone were to assert the Fifth Amendment at that point, and they may have a colorable argument for it, you can just immunize them and force them to testify. You'll be no worse off than you are now. But the idea here is that the president cannot necessarily pardon himself out of the obstruction criminal liability that he faces federally. So that, to me, is something where he may get hoisted on his own petard if you have an aggressive new attorney general in place in the Biden administration.
So even though the pardon power is plenary, if the president is giving out pardons in exchange essentially for bribe of obstructing justice or if he's doing it as part of the commission of a crime, then retroactively he may have trouble with some of these pardons.
Yeah, and maybe the easiest way to think about it, that second piece, is the president may not be able to pardon himself. In other words, the president faces clear legal liability, in my view, for obstructing our investigation, and he may try to pardon himself. That issue of whether a president can pardon himself is undecided by the Supreme Court. And everything that he is doing now can be just additional evidence of that obstruction. And that will tee up for the Supreme Court the issue of whether the president can pardon himself or not. But I'd say President Trump has certainly created the worst possible record going before the Supreme Court to say, here's a really good reason why presidents should be able to pardon themselves, because we're seeing in real time just how outrageous it is in the way that the president is using this. You made the argument last night, which is, what if he told someone to kill somebody and then said, I'll pardon you and I'll pardon myself for that murder? That clearly cannot be what the Constitution allowed. So essentially, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and a number of other people can be put in the grand jury and asked about the president to beef up a future case against the president.
Once again, that was Andrew Weissman. He worked on former special counsel Robert Mueller's team to investigate interference in the 2016 presidential election by the Russians. He worked with former special counsel Robert S. Mueller. So that just happened. So as I said, that was him on the Rachel Maddow show yesterday on MSNBC. So the President of the United States, President Donald J. Trump, has just abused the pardon power, this abhorrent abuse of the presidential pardon power, which is just a huge thing that is only and exclusively given to the President of the United States himself. Now the President has just abused that power, so potentially in the near future, that may have to be sort of, I don't know, perhaps revised or scrutinized or just looked at a bit more. So that has just happened. The President of the United States abusing his pardon power is exactly not what our founding fathers would have expected. We are a democratic republic. We are a rule of law government. Therefore, this cannot happen. Under the Trump presidency, don't say can't, because of course, anything is possible. We got much more ahead to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Introducing Tide Power Pods.
With cat and net.
I love how much I can stuff into these machines.
But that is such a large load. Don't the stains sneak through?
Please. New Tide Power Pods can clean that whole situation.
You just toss it in before the close. It's like 2 regular Tide Pods and then some power and then even more power.
With 50% more cleaning power, even your large load got clean. How many kids do you have?
Girl, I lost track. There's a lot of kids. And then there's a husband. And there's me.
That's a lot of clothes.
Meet the Ninja Foodi Air Fry Oven. Make fast, family-sized meals in the time it takes some ovens to preheat. With Ninja's superheated air, you can air fry for extra crispy, guilt-free, delicious results. And because it's a Ninja Foodi, it can do things that no other oven can. And even flip up and out of the way. The Ninja Foodi Air Fry Oven, the oven that crisps and flips away.
On January 21st, the Centers for Disease Control, otherwise known as the CDC in acronym terms, said that the first coronavirus case had been essentially diagnosed here in the United States. It was a man in Washington state. I remember essentially covering this back in July when I did the sort of read up from this New Yorker article about this doctor, Dr. Francis Rito in Washington state, saying, "Oh my goodness. It's begun. The coronavirus pandemic has just started. It has now reached our shores." So for 11 months now, we have been covering the coronavirus pandemic here on the Jeremiah Patterson Show. Right now, just more than 18 million Americans have been infected. Well over 300,000 Americans are dead. This situation here in the United States is exacerbating. 2020 has been a lot of things, from climate change to the death of a basketball star, Kobe Bryant, to essentially the President of the United States being impeached, to the politicization of the Justice Department and the resignation of one of the most controversial attorney generals since Richard Nixon, and also the George Floyd protests and protests against racial injustice and protests against racial inequality. So yes, climate change. Yes, as I said, all of that has happened this year. 2020 has been a roller coaster. But perhaps one of the most comforting things that we saw this year was the praising and the adulation of our healthcare workers for their valiant work during the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, that praise has now since sort of just, I don't know, maybe just dropped off, but it's not really happening anymore. I think all of us has gotten sort of like exhausted of being inside for so long, but we really do have to hang on. I mean, coronavirus cases are continuing to rise exponentially. Healthcare workers are telling people to stay home. In California, essentially, they are telling people to stay home as their hospitals are on the brink. We are literally watching hospitals go to capacity right now. Coronavirus cases continuing to skyrocket in multiple states all across the country. Here in South Carolina, we keep reporting more than 3,000 coronavirus cases. Just today, more than 3,600,000 new coronavirus cases. More than 3,600. And also, our governor tested positive earlier this week for COVID-19. So cases are continuing to rise exponentially. There has been an abdication of federal leadership and also presidential leadership on this. Essentially, no, we don't want to cover it anymore. But this pandemic is getting worse. Whether the president is going to lead or not on this. The president has essentially gone to Mar-a-Lago in Florida for Christmas. And nobody knows if he's going to come back to Washington, D.C. But one of the most essentially what I look at here is the COVID relief bill. So for essentially months now, for months now, the Congress has been, they have been in talks. They have been in talks for this COVID relief bill to sort of, to put this together. They have been in talks to sort of make an agreement on this. So for months now, for literally nearly 9 months now, or at least 10 months, you could say, they have been talking about this. They have been trying to make an agreement here on the COVID-19 relief bill. And what happened? Well, they came up with a $600 bill, in the bill, which included a $600 stimulus check to the American people. That was passed by the United States House of Representatives. That was also passed by the United States Senate. What happened? President Donald J. Trump, in a statement, sabotaged it. The president, after nearly just staying quiet and never even talking about this, the White House even never coming clear to reportedly just coming into this, essentially the president checking out on his bid to sabotage the election and subvert our democratic republic, all the president finally came out to say was, $600 is not enough for the American people. How about $2,000? Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, well, then great. Yeah, Mr. President, if you're serious about this, we'll bring this to the House floor and we'll vote on it by Thursday. Well, now the President of the United States has said that, and that has now sabotaged this. Because now House Democrats have brought this to the floor. The Republican Senate has just rejected it. So now we are back where we are, back from the start, where they now have to essentially agree on this again and make a deal. And that is bad news. This was Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell essentially being enraged about this just earlier this week, talking about what the president has done here and expressing her infuriation essentially among hearing stories from her constituents about this.
It is Christmas Eve, but it is not a silent night. All is not calm. For too many, nothing is bright. And for too many, they are not sleeping peacefully. I did a town hall last night that had people crying, people terrified of what is going to happen. I have for months been talking to 10 restaurant owners a day who are desperately trying to survive. I've been talking to people who were scared they were going to be kicked out from their homes during the Christmas holidays. And still might be if we don't sign this bill. A father who called me 2 weeks ago and who said to me he had told his child that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but he wanted to be able to feed her for Christmas. People don't know what the hurt is like there. Was this bill perfect? No. But it was a down payment on getting COVID relief to the people of this country. And then the president, when we finally thought that we'd be able to give people hope, that's what people need, hope, and be able to begin to continue to work on this in January, doesn't give a damn about people. He threw more fear. He threw kerosene on a terror fire and is now threatening to veto this bill. Today, Mr. Hoyer, on behalf of he and the Speaker, brought a resolution that would have immediately given that $2,000 payment that the President said he wanted. And Republicans blocked it, not Democrats. I'm merely here to say on Christmas Eve, we will come back in on Monday. I beg the President to know how many people in this country are scared, fearful, terror, hungry, and that we must get a bill done so that we are helping Americans. Compassion, empathy, kindness are the words we should remember this holiday season.
Once again, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell just speaking on Christmas Eve about the coronavirus pandemic in this very, very pivotal COVID-19 relief bill that millions of Americans need right now as they fear eviction, as they fear essentially not being able to feed their own children, as the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating not only that, but financial destitution is rising exponentially right now with millions of Americans unemployed. I wanted to also highlight something that Rachel Maddow on MSNBC said on her show earlier this week. This is her essentially talking about what the president could do when the COVID relief bill reaches his desk. Listen to this.
And here is an underappreciated truth about how this particular bit of chaos may land. Look at this for a second. Here's where we are on the calendar, right? You are here. This is where we are today. The COVID relief bill is likely to land at the White House tomorrow. It's a big, complex thing. It includes all the COVID stuff, plus funding to keep the government from shutting down, a whole bunch of stuff. It should get to the president tomorrow, at least to the White House tomorrow. Now, when that bill gets to the White House tomorrow, a few different things could happen. If the president decides to sign the bill, this was all theater and tantrum and he doesn't really care, then fine. Bill passes into law, relief checks go out, government stays funded. Or let's say the bill gets to the White House tomorrow and the president vetoes the thing. Also, not fine, but at least we could say what will happen next. The House and the Senate will then see if they have enough votes to override the veto. If so, the House and the Senate will reconvene. They will override the veto. The bill will become law. The COVID relief checks will go out. The government will stay funded. But there is a third option. Under the United States Constitution, the president has 10 days to sign a bill or veto it. 10 days, not counting Sundays. If the president doesn't act within those 10 days, the bill does not become law. It's called a pocket veto. Presidents constitutionally can block bills from becoming law that way by just letting it sit there for 10 days while they do nothing. But presidents don't really do that anymore. It hasn't been done in the whole 21st century. President Trump has never done it in his term. President Obama didn't do it in 2 terms. George W. Bush didn't do it in 2 terms. But what if that's what Trump's going to do? Put the calendar back up there. If President Trump decides that that's what he's going to do, that he's not going to do anything, if the COVID relief bill comes to his desk tomorrow and he's like, neener, neener, I'm in Florida, I'm mad, I don't care. If he just decides to let it sit there for the full 10 days the Constitution gives him, 10 days skipping Sundays like the Constitution says, then do the math and look what happens. That brings us to January 4th. January 4th is one day after this Congress will have come to an end. Anything not passed into law by the end of this Congress doesn't become law, goes back to 0, start over. So yeah, chaos when it comes to COVID relief. If President Trump gets the bill brought to him tomorrow as expected, but then he does nothing, not only would he thereby kill all COVID relief, but he would kill it in a way that the House and the Senate could not override. And we'd be back with a new Congress next year who would have to start at 0. And meanwhile, there would be no unemployment money, no stimulus, no eviction protection, no money for the states for vaccination efforts, none of it, none of any of the rest of it, and no money to keep the government funded. We would have an indefinite government shutdown on our hands. And in order to achieve all of that, all President Chaos would have to do is go golfing, enjoy tweeting, have some snacks, do nothing. Because that 10-day clock starting tomorrow will run out after the Congress is already gone. What could possibly go wrong?
Once again, that was Rachel Maddow yesterday on MSNBC, just laying that out in very, very stark, unsettling terms. Well, to give you more stark and unsettling news, it does appear that President Trump is attempting to do a pocket veto. It does appear that the president is doing that because according to public reporting today, we do not know of any sort of thing that the president has done to veto this bill. We do not know that the president has signed this bill into law. According to public reporting, as of today, it does look like the president of the United States, President Donald John Trump, is on the way to just pocket vetoing this thing. Just a pocket veto. That appears what the president is doing. Wow. Stay with us. We got much more ahead.
When we see you enter through our doors, we don't see who you're against or for. Whether tomorrow will be light or dark, all we see in you is a spark. We see your spark in each nod, each smile. We see sparks in every aisle. We see you find a hidden gem and buying diapers at 3 a.m. We see your kindness and humanity, the strength of each community. we've seen more sparks than we can say. About 20 million just yesterday. The more we look, the more we find the sparks that make America shine.
Earlier this week, outgoing Attorney General William Barr said yes, it was indeed the Russians who hacked us. Earlier this year on this massive, most sophisticated cyber attack, and reportedly, according to American intelligence officials, one of the worst cyber attacks in American history. Earlier this week, President-elect Joe Biden said that the Pentagon, the Defense Department, is no longer briefing his team. They're not even briefing him on this suspected Russian cyber attack. According to Business Insider, quote, President-elect Joe Biden said Tuesday that the Pentagon was not briefing his team on many of these issues, including the suspected Russian cyber attack on the United States government. President-elect Joe Biden said, quote, it is a grave risk, and it continues. I see no evidence that this is under control, end quote. Reportedly, Biden said that earlier this week on Tuesday. Well, we now have more reporting on this massive Russian cyber attack. According to cybersecurity officials and according to Bloomberg, which has reported this, Russian hackers' motive baffles United States, mere espionage or worse. Once again, that was the headline on Wednesday, December 3rd about this massive Russian cyber attack. We're going to have more reporting on this massive Russian cyber attack next year as we continue to follow and investigate this story as more reporting bears out, and even as more intelligence officials are continuing to investigate this cyber attack as well. As we know, President Donald Trump, we don't necessarily suspect President Trump to ever condemn the Russians for anything that they do, whether it be murder or the suspected poisoning of a Russian opponent to President Vladimir Putin, like essentially Alexei Navalny. We don't expect President Trump to do that. But as I talked about on last Sunday's episode, that is controversial. That has lots of national security implications for us as a nation, for us as a government, for us as a whole, and for the President of the United States not to just outright condemn these actions by the Russian government. This has to be an entire U.S. effort. This does not have to be unilateral. This has to be unanimously. The United States Congress, all three branches of government, everyone saying, hey, Russia, back off. Well, if the president does not do that, that has national security implications for us as a nation. And no one, as I said, no one expects the president no one expects President Trump to condemn the Russians for anything. Earlier this week, President-elect Joe Biden essentially just offered he essentially said that when he is in office, he will do completely the opposite.
The truth is this. The Trump administration failed to prioritize cybersecurity. It did that from eliminating or downgrading cyber coordinators in both the White House and at the State Department, to firing the director of Cyberspace and Infrastructure Security Agency, to President Trump's irrational downplaying of the seriousness of this attack. Enough's enough. In an age when so much of our lives are conducted online, cyber attacks must be treated as a serious threat by our leadership at the highest levels. We can't let this go unanswered. That means making clear and publicly who is responsible for the attack and taking meaningful steps to hold them in account. Initial indications, including from Secretary Pompeo, Secretary of State, and Attorney General William Barr, suggest that Russia is responsible for this breach. It certainly fits Russia's long history of reckless, disruptive cyber activities. But the Trump administration needs to make an official attribution. This assault happened on Donald Trump's watch when he wasn't watching. It's still his responsibility as president to defend American interests for the next 4 weeks. But rest assured that even if he does not take it seriously, I will.
Quote, even if he does not take it seriously, I will, end quote. Once again, President-elect Joe Biden speaking about this massive Russian cyber attack. American intelligence officials describing this as one of the most sophisticated and worst cyber attacks in American history. We will most definitely keep an eye on this story. But before we go, here on our last episode of the year of 2020, this year has been filled with loss, essentially horrifying details, disgust, hatred, happiness, and just loss and emotion and just lots more. Our emotions have been on a roller coaster this year, right? 2020 has been a real wreck, a real disaster. The Time magazine had essentially this cover where they put an X through 2020, a red X saying, no. Stephen Colbert, the comedy host, he said on CBS just earlier, he said, hopefully we have no more 2020s. If you know what he means by that. This year has been just a lot. So much has happened this year. But hopefully 2021 will be better in the spirits of more jubilant news and of more reporting on jubilant occasions. So hopefully that happens in the year of 2021. Thank you so much for being with me here on the Jeremiah Patterson Show for this year. It has really been a roller coaster with our emotions, and so much has happened. We learned to social distance and to wear our mask. This has become the new normal in the United States as the coronavirus pandemic is essentially exacerbating and becoming more prevalent in this country. Please stay home. Please stay safe. To all our healthcare workers out there, thank you so much for all that you have done this year. You guys are the best. You are indefatigable. Thank you for saving as much lives as you could. You guys were just absolutely amazing throughout this coronavirus pandemic that is still transpiring. Thank you so much for all you do. Thank you so much for all of our teachers, journalism, local journalism, and national journalism. You guys have been reporting out this year. Thank you so much for all you do. And to everyone else, happy holidays. Thank you so much for being with us this year on the Jeremiah Patterson Show. We'll see you next year.